when we start to talk about the nomadic people starting to settle down and live in one place because they learned how to farm, that's really where we start to find out the basis of what a civilization is. Now, the word city is based on the word civilization, so those are linked. And so basically, living in a civilization has some characteristics that all civilizations have in common. There are laws, there are people have jobs, there are societies rich and societies poor, there's some level of education, there's a building structure, there's some leaders, and things like that. So in order for us to go from traveling around the country in search of food to living in one place and having laws that we follow and taxes we pay, there's got to be a lot of steps involved. And I think about most civilizations are shaped a little bit like this curve. So down with the number 1, that's our hunter-gatherers. Not every civilization starts at hunter-gatherer. It depends on when in human history that civilization started. Now, we're going to be beginning to talk about a group of people who built the very first city in the history of the earth. They obviously started as hunter-gatherers. But when we think about the people who came to America and started to settle here from Europe, they don't need to start as hunter-gatherers because they already have knowledge and skills to do things with laws, and they've got some basic knowledge. So later in history, not every civilization starts at that level. Okay, but most of the civilizations that we're going to study this year do. In whatever part of the world they begin, they start at that raw hunter-gatherer stage. Then there are lots of events that happen that climb up the curve until they get to that yellow star. And that is what I call the golden age of a culture. That we're going to talk about what a golden age is. And then eventually things start to happen in the culture that lead to the decline and possible ending of that civilization or culture. All right, so every civilization we study is kind of following this curve. So how does it go? Well, at the very beginning of the curve, we've got our nomads. Everyone's job is working together just for survival. Everyone's a hunter-gatherer. So everybody's job in that clan or in that group of people is get food, prepare food, make things for survival. That's the only job that exists, all right? Then eventually, they learn how to farm. They move a little bit up on that curve. But this is the single most important event in the history of humankind. As a matter of fact, if you think about when we talked about Paleolithic people, Paleolithic life existed on Earth for, I think it said, from 70,000 years to 10,000 years. And then we went in the 60,000 years of living that way, and then we end up in just 5,000 years having writing and laws and buildings. So once we learn to farm, things start to happen really quickly. Why? Well, people can stay in one place. There's enough food for the population to be able to increase. We call in more than you need a surplus. So there's a surplus of food. People are living longer, and the food is able to sustain them. And not everyone is needed to do those jobs. Not everyone is needed for farming or gathering food, because there is more than they need, and the job, you have time to do other things. So that's when we get to one of my favorite phrases, specialization of labor. This is a phrase I need you to make sure that you learn, because without specialization of labor, a city can never develop. Okay? So there are more people in the community. Not everybody needs to do survival jobs, so people can start to learn other skills. So artisans, you can hear the word art in there, so somebody that makes something. It's kind of a synonym with craftspeople. So they start to invent things and they improve on some things that they already know how to do. So pottery, weaving, weaving of clothing, weaving of rope, weaving of baskets. They start to learn how to work with metal. So that gets us out of the Stone Age because we've got metal tools now. They invent the wheel, so we've got carts to be able to move larger loads of things, greater distances. And they start to teach each other these skills. And if I specialize in making pottery, I obviously need to be able to eat. So simple trade starts to take place. I'll make pottery so that you can keep water in it and carry it from the river if you can give me grain. And so that simple trade starts to develop. All right, then eventually trade expands. We've got lots of items. We've made enough pottery for everyone in our city, everyone in our village, and yet it's my only job. So I might travel to trade. I might travel to other cities or other areas in the region and find out what kinds of things they have that I can bring back to my city. This is around the time that writing starts to get invented, because without writing, we can't keep track. What did I trade that for? How much fish did I get for that grain? So that next year, I'm sure that I get as good a deal. And then when I meet new groups of people, I'm learning something. I'm going to learn new ways of making my pottery, or a new paint that they have developed to decorate their pots with, that now they teach me how to make. I might learn new languages. So all of those things spread knowledge around the culture. And then by that time, we've reached what we call a civilization. Fully developed cities that interact with each other in the region. There have to be laws in place so that the citizens are safe. We have leaders that collect taxes. Now, we don't have money yet. It's still just trade. So I'm probably going to pay my taxes in grain or other goods like that. There's a belief system of some kind, a religion. We educate our children to become what we are. So if I'm a potter, my children are going to learn how to make pottery so that when they grow up, they have a skill. So most people, the children, take on the job of their parents at this time in history. Men have very, very different roles than women, and they're pretty clearly defined in most ancient civilizations. And we start to see social classes develop, where there are rich people and there are poor people. And that usually depends on the amount of education that their job needs. In most cultures, farmers are the lowest level of social class because it takes the least amount of skill. Even though nobody would disagree that it's a very important job, it's still pretty low on the social scale. Whereas somebody who works perhaps in medicine, they have to learn a lot of really important things to be able to heal people or give them, medications and things like that. Or political leaders, government leaders, they have a lot of responsibility, so that tends to have a higher social class. And then eventually we get to what we call the Golden Age. And not every culture in the history of the world ever reaches a Golden Age. But basically, this is a time in that culture's history when it's pretty peaceful, they're not really having conflict with other groups around them, and there's a lot of creativity going on. So a lot of architecture, art being built. If it's a culture that values writing, they're doing creative types of writing. Not every culture has that as a basis of importance. But the cities are big, well protected, and fairly peaceful at the time of a Golden Age. Now, eventually, every civilization has a decline. Every civilization has something that starts to happen that leads them to be less important in the eyes of the world. For example, at one point, ancient Egypt was the single most important civilization on the planet. So was ancient Greece. So was ancient Rome. All of those places still exist, but they have much less importance in the grand scheme of the world today than they did thousands of years ago. And that is because they have decreased from their golden age, their time of importance, and that can happen for a lot of different reasons. So let's look at some of those. Now, the decline of a civilization doesn't happen quickly, and one event really can't cause it. One of the most important things to think about when you're talking about the decline of a civilization is leadership. If they've got a strong leader or a series of strong leaders that the people in the civilization follow and obey, for lack of a better word, the civilization can survive a lot of things. All right? But if there's a weak leadership where the people don't necessarily respect or follow that leader's suggestions and decisions, lots of different simple acts, natural and otherwise, can come in and destroy a civilization over time. So some of the things that can happen: you can have a natural disaster. If a flood were to wipe out your city and you don't have the tax collection to rebuild, your civilization's in trouble. If you don't have the people who are willing to help get behind your leadership to help you rebuild from a natural disaster, you're in trouble. Invasions from other groups of people, wars and things like that. Strong leaders can get you through a war. Weak leaders, that's probably where most groups of people end. Ancient Mesopotamia, as we're going to learn, was lots of different groups of people. Eventually, other groups like the Persians and the Egyptians just kind of came in and said, this land is ours. And so the groups in Mesopotamia kind of became part of Persia or became part of Egypt. So they didn't have the identity of a Sumerian anymore. They were now Egyptian in who they followed. All right, so that's kind of the end result. But other things like a drought, a famine, not having enough food to feed your people, some sort of a blight or an illness that can wipe out too much of the population. Suddenly you don't have the surplus of people to do the jobs, and now everybody has to go back to finding food. So if there was a city of 500 people and now we're down to 200 people, those 200 people are probably not going to be able to specialize anymore. They're going to have to work together to make sure that they survive and get through that time. So all of these types of things, natural disasters, invasions, droughts, illnesses, floods, a lack of food, all of these types of things can eventually bring that civilization out of a golden age. And they either become assimilated into another culture, where that land is taken over by a different group of people, or that language and that society just kind of disappears. All right, so as we study all of these different cultures this year, we're going to try to figure out the steps to how did they increase their importance in the world. Did they reach a golden age and what was it like? And then eventually what led to their decline?